Edward and the Railtour. Diesel buffered up to Edward very quickly. "Slow down, Diesel," he exclaimed. "What's the rush?" "You'll never believe it," Diesel replied. 7102 has crashed and is being sent home for bad behaviour. If we finished your overhaul by morning, you should be able to take the Railtour in her place, but we have to work fast. The question is, do you agree to this?" Edward looked around. He felt uncertain. All the other engines looked at him eagerly. They looked kind, but Edward thought he sensed a feeling of expectation in their gazes. Then he remembered Ned. He sighed. "All right," he said. "Lead on, Diesel." Quickly, Diesel shunted him into the workshops. Immediately, the workmen sprang into action. They worked all through the night. They had already fitted Edward with his new boiler some days ago, once the men at Crovan's gate had built it, and were now working on his joints. It was at this point, however, that something was wrong. "The vacuum brake's not working," cried a fitter. "Why ever not?" asked the chief mechanical engineer. "I'm just taking it apart to check," the fitter replied. Edward waited, anticipating the worst. "Oh, it's only because the joint for the handle was dirty," the fitter said. "Hang on a tick, I'll just clean it up." Everyone breathed a sigh of relief. All, that is, except for Edward. The fact that his brakes had caused problems made him feel worse. He was usually the kindest and wisest of the engines, but recently he began to feel uncertain about himself. He was worried about whether or not Ned would still be proud of him. After all, when he was young, he had left Mr. Mac at the station and caused a mix-up with several telegraphs. These feelings of self-doubt he had hidden away for years seemed to have quickly returned as soon as he had spoken about them to Diesel. Now, they consumed his every thoughts. He looked at himself. Everyone expected to see an engine who was a pillar of railway society. Yet behind it all was a little engine, scared and uncertain in himself. Soon, the fitter had cleaned the joint and fixed it back into place. Edward watched on as the men busied themselves around him once more. No matter how hard they worked, he could not shake off a feeling that they too were expecting him to perform well. At last, tired and nervous, he gave a yawn and fell asleep. If he had felt more certain in himself, he would never have had the dream. He dreamt he was pulling the Railtour. He was thundering along the line, going dangerously over the speed limits. In the distance, he could see some familiar shapes. He tried to stop, but his wheels didn't respond. He kept charging towards the figures. He could see them all the more clearly. On one side was Eagle, on another were Annie and Clarabelle. On the line beside his was Neil, and right in front of him were... Edward whistled in horror. 98462 and 87546 sat in front of Neil's goods train.
"Miserable old relic,"
called 98462.
"Can't even take his train without messing up,"
mocked 87546. Edward shut his eyes as he crashed right into them. "No! No!" he cried as he fell onto the ballast, dented all over. "That wasn't what happened! That wasn't what happened! That what?" But his panicking was cut short as another engine sped towards him. Edward gasped in horror, for rushing straight towards them was Mars with the express. "Peep, peep! Out of my way, you load of antiquated old iron!" Mars demanded. Edward shut his eyes again, and felt Mars push him further onto his side. As the smoke and flames arose, Edward opened his eyes and looked around him. He saw Neil sitting on one line, pushed off the rails. Or at least it was Neil's shape. So Edward found it difficult to understand how it came to have James's face on it. "Edward, is it impossible?" he said. He clanks about like a lot of old iron, and he is so slow that he makes us wait. Edward gasped in shock. He looked around again. He saw 98462. Only it wasn't him because it had Henry's face on it.
Did you see him straining?
He asked. Neil, or rather James, agreed.
Positively painful.
Then, Edward noticed a change in 87546's appearance. He was now wearing Gordon's face.
Just pathetic,
he said.
He should give up and be preserved before it is too late.
Edward looked towards Eagle, Annie, and Clarabelle. Their faces hadn't changed, that he was relieved to see. But when they spoke, their voices sounded different, gravelly, electronic. The driver won't choose you again, they said. He wants big, strong engines like us. Finally, Edward looked at Mars. Only Mars wasn't there. In his place sat Ned, a look of fury on his face. So, leave I to die without that great snake in the grass, he bellowed. Edward stammered. Ned, father! Dinner thou father me, thou stupid great wazzock. I wish that never that people of thee knew. Thou pushes me to my limits of patience, then thou lets me die of rotting explosion. Thou near son of mine. As far as I'm bothered, thou can rot in hell. Suddenly, the scene around him changed. He found himself in a smelter's depot. Various bits and pieces of broken up engines lay all around him. Approaching him was a stout man. Just before he started cutting, the man lifted his visor to reveal himself as the Fat Controller.
You're far too useless for me to keep anymore, Edward,
he said, grinning.
At least I can find a purpose for you at last.
And he grinned maniacally as he began his work. This was all Edward could take. He screamed at the top of his voice and woke up. It was early morning, and the workmen had been alarmed by his outburst. They immediately stopped their work and ran to his front. "Whatever's the matter, Edward?" they asked. "You sound like you were just murdered or something." Edward looked around him. He was still in the workshop. Relieved, he gave a heavy sigh and said simply, "Nothing, sirs. Nothing at all." But the workmen refused to believe this, and explained everything to Edward's crew as soon as they arrived. While the fireman lit the fire, the driver opened his smokebox door and emptied out the ash. Then he closed it, jumped down onto the ground and spoke to Edward. "What's wrong, old boy?" he asked kindly. Edward looked sadly at him and explained. "With all due respect, sir, ever since I've been on this overhaul, I've been thinking more and more about my past. You heard about Ned, what we've been through together, what happened when I left England for Sodor?" The driver nodded his head gravely. "I understand. But that's all in the past, Edward. You surely should have let go of his death by now." "I did, sir," Edward protested. "But everything I told the other engines brought back all those old memories. Memories which made me wonder, is he still proud of me?" "Of course he would be," laughed the driver. "I mean, not many engines can lay claim to being the sole survivor of their kind for a start." He looked up at Edward, hoping for a positive reaction, but was disappointed. "Look, cheer up, boy," he said. "At least you get to take the Railtour. You've passed all the tests, and the workmen tell me you're ready to go. Come on, let's get you to the station." He climbed into the cab, the workshop doors opened, and piercing bright flashes erupted in Edward's eyes. Crowds upon crowds of people jostled around the line side, which was fenced off. Slowly he went to the platform where Eagle was waiting. "Good to see you back in steam, Edward," Eagle grinned as Edward backed down onto him. Now let's give these people a run for their money, eh? Of course, Edward said uncertainly. The crowd who had seen him depart from the museum seemed to have followed him to the station. At that moment, Duck arrived with Alice and Mirabelle, both of whom were full of passengers from the Little Western and the Isledale Miniature Railway. He had picked these passengers up from a special service operated by Rex. A few minutes later, Bertie pulled in with some passengers who had caught first a special pulled by Coldie, then boarded him at Kirkmacken. These added to the ever-increasing number of passengers already on the platform. They were now milling all over him, asking questions and taking their pictures with him. Edward tried to answer all their questions and to smile for the cameras, but it was no good. His heart wasn't into it. The fat controller was on the platform and saw how sad Edward looked. He whispered something to the porter, who tactfully shepherded the passengers on board and went to speak with Edward.
Whatever's the matter, Edward?
He asked, a look of concern on his face.
Today is the anniversary of the Thin Clergyman's book about you. You should be happy.
Please, sir, replied Edward. It's not that, it's just I keep thinking about Ned. He was practically a father to me, as I'm sure your grandfather told you. I wasn't exactly the perfect engine when I was young, so I wonder if he is still proud of me.
I see,
said the fat controller.
Well, all I can say is that sometimes you just need to think back on what else you have done in your lifetime and feel proud of yourself for those things. You're one of the best engines on this railway, Edward, and I'm proud to have you as a member. Now do your best on this train, please. I shall be riding with you on board the train, and I know you'll deliver us to Knapford in fine style.
Thank you, sir, said Edward, but he still felt afraid. After what seemed like an eternity, it was time to leave. The guard blew his whistle and waved his green flag. Slowly but surely, Edward and Eagle forced the train into motion. Come on, come on, come on, Eagle puffed. Can I do it? Can I do it? Can I do it? Edward puffed. But he could. Go to it, you two, cheered Duck. Best of luck, honked Bertie. Soon they were running nicely along the line. Bridges and stations flashed by. The Railtour pounded along the line until it reached Crovan's gate. Edward and Eagle stood at the platform and waited as Skarloey pulled in with his passengers for the Railtour, his boiler polished and his brass fittings shining like gold. Edward managed a slight chuckle as he wondered how James would react to this.
We all have faith in the pair of you, Skarloey encouraged. Make this day one to remember for everyone.
Thank you, the two engines replied. They waited a few more minutes for the passengers to take photographs and board their train, then they set off for Wellsworth. They charged up and over Gordon's Hill with every ounce of steam they had. All the while, Edward felt a funny feeling in his right-hand side. A feeling that something wasn't quite right. They halted at Wellsworth just as Boko arrived. Edward and Eagle took on water while allowing more time for passengers to take photographs and board the coaches.
Bill and Ben say they hope you don't break down, Boko chuckled.
Typical, Edward gave a small laugh.
But I say, go it, the pair of you, encouraged Boko.
Believe me, we will, agreed Eagle. Soon they left Wellsworth, and as they picked up speed, Edward felt different. He remembered everything everyone said to him that day. Everyone's counting on me, he thought. I can't let them down. With this thought in his mind, he powered on, determined to pull the Railtour to Knapford to the very end. We must do it! We must do it! We must do it! He puffed. We will do it! We will do it! We will do it! Eagle snorted. We must do it! We will do it! We must do it! We will do it! We must do it! We will do it! They snorted together. Edward pulled with all his might. The train flew down the line. Fields and buildings became mere blurs to the two engines. They wanted to get their train to Knapford right on time. They whistled as they passed Thomas, who was heading to Knapford to meet them at the junction. But then there was trouble. As the train continued to power on, Edward began to feel a strange pain in his right-hand side again. He struggled on, determined not to let it beat him. But it grew more and more painful until... crack! Wheesh! A large cloud of steam erupted around Edward. All at once, his confidence vanished as the train slowed down and his eyes shut tight. It's no good, he cried. I can't go on. Then he bellowed out, I can't go on! He opened his eyes once more. He was surrounded in darkness. All around him, shapes floated, resembling engines. Some of them came up to him. Edward recognized them from his dream.
Miserable old relic,
98462 said.
Can't even take his train without messing up,
said 87546. Antiquated old iron, agreed Mars.
Did you see him straining?
Asked Henry.
Positively painful,
agreed James.
Just pathetic, finished Gordon. He should give up and be preserved before it is too late.
But then, these figures seemed to be joined by several other figures. Each of these looked familiar too. With a gasp, Edward could see Thomas, Percy, Duck, Boko, and even his old driver, Sidney Heaver.
Shut up,
snapped Duck.
You're all jealous.
Edward's better than any of you.
You're right, Duck,
agreed Boko.
Edward's old, but he'll surprise us all.
James seemed to snort at this.
Edward is impossible. He clanks about like a lot of old iron, and he is so slow that he makes us wait.
Thomas and Percy adopted indignant looks.
Old iron?
They exclaimed.
Slow?
Why? Edward could beat you in a race any day. But the first six figures continued unabated. The driver won't choose you again, they boasted. He wants big, strong engines like us. Why are you so sad? Came a voice. This time it was from Sidney Heaver. Would you like to come out today? Yes, please, replied Edward, touched at the question. But then the figures seemed to disappear. All at once, Edward found himself in his old shed at Barrow in Furness. He looked about him and saw Ned in the berth next to him, just as he used to be, steamed up and ready for work. Hello, son. Ned smiled kindly. Dad didn't think that I'd forget thy own dad. No, stammered Edward. Why so scary? Ned asked. Nothing, quaked Edward nervously. I didn't say that, kidder, Ned retorted. Edward sighed. I've been thinking, he began, about what happened. Every time I messed up, I thought you might not be proud of it, asked Ned. Edward looked down at the pit. Listen, kidder, who said I wasn't proud of thou? Ned exclaimed. Of course I is. But I left Mr. Mac behind. I made the typist send the wrong message. I couldn't do anything to stop that explosion. I just left you to die. Edward burst out. The fears and anxieties pent up inside him now cascaded in an overwhelming wave of sadness. His tears dripped onto his running board as he sniffed and continued. I didn't stop in time.
I could have tried to arrive earlier. I could have shunted that truck myself.
Nay, Edward, it wasn't like that, Ned said calmly.
Why do you say that?
Edward shrieked.
It was my fault you died. Surely that's enough for you to hate me.
He looked at Ned, gasping for breath before collapsing into sobs. There was a long silence. At last, Ned let out a small chuckle. "Thou really thinkst that?" he said. "That great daft aper. The only thing I cared about when that happened was what happened to thou. Ain't they? I could ne'er do that. Yon Thin Clergyman told me all. How thou helped that great bull lummox uphill, and took his train when his safety valve burst. How thou got the picker to rescue thy traction engine for scrap. How thou caught that red sausage when two lads set him off. How thou brought thy train home during the storm with only one side rod. Thou's done more than enough for our one to be proud of thee, son." Edward looked at him, tears still roaming down his eyes. The shed around them seemed to be getting dimmer and dimmer. We both knows I was going to be scrapped anyhow, Ned continued. I didn't want to die, but I prefer to die myself instead of letting thou die. I did what father is cold would do. Now the two engines were in complete darkness. A beam of bright light glowed behind Ned as he too began to fade away. Someone tells me thou needs to read my letter, thou'll understand then, he said, as he finally disappeared into the light. I'll always be proud of thee. Thou's always going to be my son, Edward the Blue Engine. Eventually, the light consumed Edward. It was so bright that he closed his eyes and found himself back on the main line. The Railtour was still moving, but now it was going slower and slower. "Edward," called Eagle, "you all right? Something flew off you and you let off a lot of steam." Edward felt a smile spreading across his face and a feeling of peace. He hadn't felt this way for days. "I'm fine," he called. "Keep going, Eagle. I'll soon have steam up." Eagle grinned. Edward was back to his old self at last. "With pleasure," he replied. "Driver," said Edward, "the letter in my cab, can you please read it to me?" "Why?" asked the driver. "Just do it," Edward retorted. So the driver brought it down and read it. "Dear Edward, I said at the end of my days, and I know it's gonna be rough by thyself, but there's something I must tell thou. Thou'st come so far so short a while. There'll come a time when thou'll be a bed named more. Maybe thou'll end up forgetting about me. That's fine, lad. I only ask that thou do thy best where thou goes, and that thou get thy work all thou can, on Soda or Australia or something. Ne'er gain one, no matter who they treat thee. I's always proud of thee, my son. Thy loving dad." Everyone was humbled by this. They had never heard something more meaningful or more moving before. Edward smiled. His right-hand side still hurt after that part of him flew off, but his fire was burning nicely and he had plenty of steam again. "Let's do this," he called out. Then looking up to the heavens he shouted, "This is for you, father!" "Do engines even have parents?" asked his fireman. "Who cares?" replied his driver. "Look at him now. That letter must have had some greater effect on him than on us. For heaven's sakes, get back to shoveling that coal." He opened the regulator wide. "Go it, Edward!" he called. The coupling between Edward and Eagle tightened almost at once as his wheels slipped and sparks flew. Eagle began to pull harder in turn. All at once, the train began to pick up speed again. The passengers were told everything and they leaned out of their window and cheered him on. all except the Fat Controller, who, after placing his hat on his seat, merely smiled warmly and encouragingly as he leaned out of his window. The train soared past houses and bridges, photographs going off like detonators all around as they clattered past signals and eventually pulled into the big station at Knapford, where Henry, Gordon, James, Percy, Toby and Duck all waited. Everyone clapped, cheered and whistled as the Railtour pulled in. Excited passengers cheered and thanked Edward for his effort as Bear took him off the train and then took his driver to find the part that had flown off. Only a handful of people noticed when Thomas arrived with his excursion from the branch line, but he didn't mind at all when they told him what had happened.
Well done, Edward, he cheered. I don't know where we'd be without you. Nor I, Ned, Edward beamed.
Thomas was puzzled.
Who's Ned?
He asked. The Fat Controller cleared his throat.
I'll explain later,
Edward said.
Ladies, gentlemen, and engines,
said the Fat Controller, standing near the Thin Clergyman's bust.
I'd like to welcome a very special guest to speak with you. His father wrote about us, and in time, so did he. Please welcome Christopher Audrey.
A large round of applause met this, as a thin, elderly man with grey hair and a beard took the podium and began to speak. A long time ago, he began, my father came to this railway. He was a man with a young family, as well as a, thin clergyman, for want of his own description. I saw him writing stories several times, as well as hearing them in bed when I came down with measles, and not once did I ever see him give up in his dedication for this railway. There were many personal struggles he had to face during that time. Problems at work with a decreasing audience, problems at home with the balance between work and family life, and naturally problems with rationing as a result of World War II. But, through it all, he never gave up in his desire to tell stories about our friends, just like Edward, the engine who began those stories 75 years ago on this day, did not give up in his duties today, despite overwhelming personal and mechanical crises. I say 3 cheers for Edward and for my father, the Reverend Wilbert Audrey. The sound of cheering, clapping and whistling could be heard for miles around. Soon, Bear rumbled back into the station.
Found this near the junction,
he said, as Edward's driver produced the missing part from his cab. Edward looked at it.
My oil cap, he exclaimed. My joints won't work without that. Thank you, Bear.
No problem,
Bear replied. I had to walk 20 meters to find it, Edward's driver added. I'll mention it to the lads at the museum, all right. Here's hoping it doesn't fall off anytime soon. Edward could only agree. The Fat Controller had arranged for the 8 steam engines gathered there to travel to Vickerstown on parade, with Eagle and Bear taking the Railtour ahead of them on a return journey to let Edward rest. Edward took place at the front of the engines. Then came Thomas, Henry, Gordon, James, Percy, Toby, Duck, Annie, Clarabelle, and last but by no means least, Henrietta, who was most honoured to have both the Fat Controller and the Thin Clergyman's son aboard her. The cavalcade puffed down the line, with people waving and photographs taken from all angles. When they arrived there, they found City of Truro, Flying Scotsman, Stepney, and even Bayer waiting for them. Eagle and Bear had told them everything. Bear had just left to take his afternoon goods train, and Eagle was shunting off home to the museum.
An excellent job, Edward,
greeted Flying Scotsman.
Your dedication to your passengers would impress Brunel himself.
said City of Truro. Hooray for Edward! Cheered Stepney. But Bayer was the warmest of all. We heard all about it from the other two, he explained. Well done, old friend.
Thank you, smiled Edward. Thank all of you.
Then followed some more speeches, and afterwards all the engines were lined up outside the museum, with Donald, Douglas, Oliver and Toad on display alongside them. But right at the front of it all stood Edward and Thomas, both with equally sized crowds. Not surprisingly, Thomas's crowd asked him some rather awkward questions about whether or not he had really been to any other country aside from Sodor and the mainland, like he had in the TV series. So both engines were glad when Thomas asked,
Edward, you mentioned someone called Ned earlier. Who was he exactly?
Edward was touched by this question and began telling everyone all about Ned and their days working together. Meanwhile, with a decently sized crowd around them, Diesel and Denise watched everything. That Edward is quite a remarkable engine, she said. Her eyes turned back almost seductively to Diesel. Though not as handsome as you.
And he's not as pretty as you either,
replied Diesel. The two shunters blushed and broke into giggles. Come on, gorgeous, grinned Denise. Why don't you tell me what else happened to Edward? Right from the very beginning. Diesel looked at the other engines and smiled as he began his story.
Once upon a time, there was a little engine called Edward.